Well guys, today unfortunately I had to serve another eviction notice, and unfortunately this isn't the first time that I've had to do that. And I can tell you that every single time I have to serve an eviction notice, it's never fun. When this comes up, it's generally because somebody has mismanaged their money, or they've fallen on hard times, they haven't been working enough, or maybe they've lost their job, or something happened where they weren't able to get that money coming in order to make their rent. And like I said, this is just never a pleasant experience. It's not good for me, it's not good for the tenant, and it just is an unfortunate experience all the way around. So I thought that it would be fitting to give you guys a breakdown of how the eviction process works so that you can get a better idea of what to expect if you're ever on the receiving end of this, which I hope you aren't. Or if you're on the landlord side where you're the one serving the notice, you kind of have an idea of how the process works and what to expect along the way. Now, before I go any further, I should say that I am not an attorney. I'm not a professional eviction lawyer or anything like that. I'm just a landlord who's done this a few times, and I want to share my experience with it. You definitely should consult with an attorney and with a professional for how this process works in your state. And that's the other thing that I want to mention as well, is that this process will vary from state to state to state. Every single state has different rules about how the eviction process works, what the timelines are. Every single detail about the eviction process is going to be different in one state than it is from the next. So again, check with your state to figure out what those rules are and to make sure that you have a good idea. So I'm just going to be giving you a breakdown of what my rules are here in my state, which is Utah, and give you guys an overview of kind of how this process works here locally for me, and give you an overview of what kind of experience, or what kind of process I've been through for this. So in addition to that, some states are more pro landlord and other states are going to be more pro tenant. So based on which state you're in, you're either going to have rules and laws that favor the landlord more or that favor the tenant. Now, I'm not saying that you're just going to get a state that's, it doesn't give any rights to the other party, but every state does have different rules that will tend to lean more towards one side or the other. You'll generally find that states that are more liberal are typically more on the pro-tenant side. They're more in favor of giving these people a second chance, giving them rules and laws to protect them during the eviction process. While on the other hand, you'll find that states that are typically a little bit more conservative are generally more pro-landlord, right? They're a little bit more strict on these timelines, and it basically comes down to it a lot of the time saying, hey, if you don't pay your rent, you're gonna get evicted, and that's just how it is. So you know that your rent is coming up on the 1st of every month. It's not a surprise expense. It's not like, your car broke down and now all of a sudden you have to pay all this money. That can happen, and it can affect how you pay your rent, but you do know that you're gonna have to make that rent payment every single month. So it shouldn't come as a surprise when the 1st of the month rolls around that you are gonna have that expense. And guys, if this is your first time to the channel, my name's Cody. I share information about real estate, passive income, entrepreneurship, self-employment, all things business and finance here on the channel. I'd love for you to be a part of it. If you're interested in stuff like this and you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel to get updates on future videos. All right, so enough is enough. Let's actually jump into how this eviction process works and give you a breakdown of what to expect along the way. And again, I'm in Utah, so I'm gonna give you a breakdown of how things work here for me, and then you can compare that to how your state is when it comes to an eviction in your state. So I'm actually really thankful to be in Utah and have my rental properties here in Utah because they are more pro-landlord. Like I said earlier, if you don't pay your rent, you're gonna get evicted, and that's kind of how Utah and the courts here see the whole process as well. So what will happen first is the 1st of the month rolls around and you're supposed to pay rent, right? Generally, most landlords or property management companies are going to have some sort of a grace period. So for me, my grace period is 5 days. So the 1st of the month rolls around, you have until the 5th to pay your rent, or you're going to get that notice. Some landlords are not as flexible, A lot of them will give you, if it's not paid on the 1st, it's late after that. If it's not paid on the 3rd, it's late after that. So it is up to the landlord a little bit on when the actual rent is going to be late, but I give my tenants up to 5 days to pay that rent. So they've got a 5-day grace period. They know that it's due on the 1st. They can pay it beforehand. They can pay it on the 1st or during that grace period with no penalties up until the 5th. After the 5th, they start getting late fees assessed. So the late fee here is 10% of the monthly rent. So if their rent's $1,000, they have a $100 late fee that they have to pay. And then it's another $10 a day after that until they pay the rent. So generally what happens is after that 5-day grace period, I'm gonna reach out to them, right? I always give them an opportunity to pay me or at least tell me what's going on why they haven't paid rent. but I'm going to reach out to them, say, hey, what's going on? I haven't seen your rent check come through yet. Is everything okay? You know, sometimes it's a positive conversation, sometimes it's not. So after that 5 days, if I haven't heard from them or I don't have a payment, I'm going to go and post what's called a 3-day pay or vacate notice. Now, this is a notice that you post on the door. You can send it through the verified mail, or you can deliver it to the tenant in person. You just have to get it to them and verify that you actually did that. So what I generally do, I always try and get it to them in person if I can, but if they're not home or, you know, schedules don't line up or whatever, I'll post it on their front door, I'll tape it on there and take a couple of pictures just to prove that I did post it there and it's in a reasonable, you know, wide open space where they're actually going to see it. And what this notice actually says is it says that they have 3 days to pay and catch up on the rent that is owed, or they need to vacate the property. It also says that if you do not pay all of the money you owe within 3 calendar days, counting weekends and holidays, you must vacate the premises that you have rented. If you do not comply with this notice, you will be served a summons and complaint for unlawful detainer. Unlawful detainer is when you remain in possession of rental property after the owner serves you with a lawful notice to leave, such as this eviction notice. If you are found by the court to be in unlawful detainer, you will be evicted by the court and you will be liable for the following. So this is a breakdown of how this notice actually works. Like I said, you pay the rent, you catch up, and everything's good until the next month. Generally, you do have to pay those late fees as part of that. And if you don't pay your rent and catch up after those 3 days, you've either got the option to vacate the property, which is what the notice tells you to do, or you're then going to be in unlawful detainer where you're occupying the property without having paid rent. So at that point, you do get the summons and complaint from the court. Generally, at this point, I hand everything over to the attorney. So I will go and serve the 3-day notice myself just because it's easy. I'm not going to pay somebody like $100 or $150 to go and do that when I can just print it up, fill out a couple boxes and drop it off anytime I'm in the area. So that's a lot easier for me to do, and I don't want to hand it over because sometimes these issues do get resolved once you post that notice up. So I'll post the notice. After those 3 days, if they still haven't paid, this is when I hand it over to my attorney and they take it from there. The attorney and their office is going to file and serve that summons and complaint, which basically is a notice to the court saying, hey, we have a tenant that has not paid their rent. They're now occupying this property in unlawful detainer, and we request that they get evicted from the property. Now, at this point, this is where it can get a little bit hairy just because the situation gets a little bit more in depth. So once the complaint and summons is served to the tenant then has to respond to that notice and request an occupancy hearing, at which time it will go before the courts, and then they'll determine if a trial is needed, right? So this might be the situation if the tenant says, hey, I paid my rent and the landlord didn't give me a receipt, or I paid cash and they lost it. You know, if there's a problem between the tenant and the landlord and they're not able to come to terms, then the tenant can actually go through and fight the eviction process and try to argue with the courts that they should not be evicted. So this goes down this path of, you know, 2 different routes, right? The tenant either responds and requests an occupancy hearing, which at that point it will go before the courts, or if the tenant doesn't respond, then it will go to the landlord, and the landlord can file a judgment to return possession to the landlord, at which time the courts will generally grant that. So this is the path that I've been down every single time I've done this. I've never had a tenant respond to the eviction notice or to the complaint and summons. And so my attorney's always been able to help me out and get that judgment to have the courts return possession to me. At this point, the court actually does award the landlord, you know, restitution for some of the fees that they've had. This can include the rent that's owed, any filing and serving fees, attorney fees, any damage, things like that. There's a whole list of items that the landlord can actually collect on, although most times they generally don't. Once the landlord has obtained that judgment to return possession, again, you've got a few options. The tenant can either move out voluntarily, or they might put their feet down and try and stay for the long term, at which time a constable may need to get involved and will have to come to the property, help remove the tenant forcibly, and then the landlord can then change the locks. And the way that this works, because our legal system is set up in such a good way, the tenant does have the opportunity to come back and say that they were evicted, you know, improperly, but that doesn't happen very often. In Utah, the tenant usually has up to 3 days to respond to that complaint and summons. If they don't have it by that time, the landlord can then proceed with the judgment. So the eviction process here in Utah can move really quick. I mean, you can have 3 days for the 3-day pay or vacate notice, and then you've got 3 days for the complaint and summons. And if you don't have that, then you go in front of the court to get that judgment to return possession to the landlord. And again, this will vary a little bit based on how busy the courts are and how quickly you can get in. But this process can be done in anywhere from about 2 to 4 weeks generally. Again, in other states, it can be quicker or longer, most likely longer, because 2 to 4 weeks is pretty quick for an eviction to happen. I've heard of these things getting drug out for 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, which in my opinion is just ridiculous. So I'm very grateful to live in a pro-landlord state where they do generally tend to favor the landlords as long as you've got the proof that the tenant hasn't made their payment. Now, I should mention at this point that I'm not saying just because I'm a landlord that I don't believe tenants have rights or shouldn't, have a place to live. I do 100% believe in that. But like I said, the tenant should know that the rent is coming up each and every month. It's not a surprise when it comes up, and you have to budget and plan for that accordingly. And if you don't, the rules are the rules, right? This is a business relationship, and things have to be taken care of according to the rental agreement, just like any other contractual agreement. So jumping back, let's say that a tenant does decide to fight the complaint and summons and they want to have an occupancy hearing requested before the courts. The court can assess that, and then it goes to trial, right? They might go to trial, they might have the judge just decide. Again, this is way above my pay grade, so consult with your professional. Don't sue me. I'm just giving you some general advice here on how the process works, but at this point it does get a little hairy, and it can go back and forth and go through the legal system at that point. So if the landlord is the one who wins the trial, they can actually go and get a judgment against the tenant and then proceed to move forward with the eviction. As we've stated before, they go through, they get the judgment for repossession and then take back the property. If the tenant is the one who wins, they can actually file to get a judgment of their own against the landlord to cover any of the fees that the tenant might have had along the way. The tenant is then going to be able to collect on that to get some of their money back for having to go through the process. Now, there are some other specialty rules that I should mention along with this. So here in Utah, when the landlord takes back the property from the tenant, what do you do with all of their stuff, right? The landlord actually has to hold on to the tenant's stuff and keep it in a safe manner for up to 15 days and give the tenant time to come and get that property back from the landlord. If it's been 15 days and they haven't received it, the landlord can then sell it or get rid of it as they see fit. Now, because the landlord is required to hold this property for the tenant generally does have to pay in order to get that property back, and nobody really wins in this situation, right? The landlord has to hold on to property that they don't want, and the tenant is out having the access and ability to get all of that property that's personal to them. So the landlord can charge for moving and storage fees of these products, but it is up to the tenant to pay for those fees in order to get their stuff back. The other thing that I do want to mention is that you do have to have a court order to legally evict someone. This is true in Utah, and I imagine that it's true in most states. You can't just go into a property, kick them out, and change the locks, and then just take back the property just because you chose to do that or just because they haven't paid rent. You do have to go through the proper court and legal proceedings in order to legally evict somebody and take back possession of the property. So guys, that wraps up our video here. I hope this was helpful for you. If it was, please consider subscribing to the channel by clicking that red button down below and clicking that bell to get notified when I release new videos like this. We talk about all things real estate, passive income, finance, entrepreneurship, everything here on this channel, and I'd love to see you back here again. Give me a thumbs up on the video and drop a comment below with your thoughts and your perspective on how the eviction process works. I'd love to hear from you. Last but not least, follow me on Instagram at @UtahRealEstate_. I try to post there often, and I'd love for you to be a part of it as well. Until next time.